My sister had never sounded afraid of anything in her life. We grew up in the same house, survived the same impossible expectations, and somehow became two completely different women. I was the one who believed every problem could be solved if I worked hard enough. Noelle was the one who noticed the things everyone else pretended not to see. That was why, when my phone rang just 15 minutes after I dropped my parents off, I answered with a smile I didn't know would disappear forever. "Hey," I said as I merged onto the highway. "Did you forget something at Mom and Dad's?" There was nothing but breathing for a second. Then she whispered, "Vivian, don't go home." My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "What? Please? Pull over somewhere safe. Don't drive home. Just check your security cameras first." I felt a strange chill crawl across my shoulders even though the afternoon sun was pouring through the windshield. "Noelle, what happened?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just trust me." "Please." She ended the call before I could ask another question. I took the next exit without thinking and pulled into the parking lot of a quiet garden center that had already closed for the day. I shut off the engine and stared at my phone for several seconds. My heart was beating far too fast for someone who didn't even know what she was afraid of. Maybe there had been a break-in. Maybe one of my employees had accidentally triggered the alarm. Maybe my parents had forgotten something before heading to the charity banquet. There had to be a reasonable explanation. My entire life had been built on reasonable explanations. I opened the security app. The first camera showed my front porch, empty. The second overlooked the kitchen, nothing unusual. Then I tapped the camera in my home office. My breath caught in my throat. My father was standing beside the antique oak desk my grandmother had given me the year I started my company. My mother stood beside him, watching the hallway while he unlocked the small wall, safe hidden behind one of my framed architectural sketches. I blinked several times, convinced the feed had frozen on an old recording. They were supposed to be halfway across town, preparing for the fundraising dinner. I had driven them there myself less than 20 minutes earlier, yet the timestamp in the corner of the screen read live. My father carefully removed several folders from the safe and laid them across my desk. My mother opened one of them while glancing nervously toward the hallway. Then she reached into a leather briefcase and placed another stack of documents in exactly the same position. It looked almost rehearsed. "What are you doing?" I whispered to myself, even though they couldn't hear me. My phone buzzed again. It was Noelle. I answered immediately. "I'm watching." She let out a shaky breath. "I know. How did you know they were there?" "Because I saw them leave the banquet parking lot before you even reached the highway." I frowned. "They never went inside?" "No." My stomach tightened. "They watched you drive away. Then they came back. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen." My father worked with slow confidence, replacing one folder after another as though he had done it many times before. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't nervous. He acted like he belonged there. In a way, he probably believed he did. Gerald Ashford had spent his entire life believing everything connected to this family belonged to him. Growing up, I never questioned that. He built a successful woodworking shop from almost nothing before I was born. When I was a teenager, he taught me how to sand walnut by hand until it felt like silk. He used to tell everyone I had inherited his patience. What he never admitted was that the company people admired today barely resembled the little workshop he started decades ago. After college, I spent years rebuilding the business from the ground up. I expanded into custom interiors, hired designers, opened a showroom, landed commercial contracts, and turned our tiny family shop into one of the fastest growing design firms in the state. Every award hanging in my office represented years of 18-hour workdays. My parents always smiled proudly whenever reporters interviewed me. They loved telling people how proud they were. At least that's what I believed. "Vivian?" Noelle said softly. "Keep watching." The office door opened. A man I had never seen before walked inside carrying a slim black portfolio. He looked to be in his early 50s, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit. My father greeted him with a handshake instead of surprise. My mother closed the office door behind him. My pulse quickened. The stranger spread several documents across my desk while my father pointed at different pages. I couldn't hear every word through the security camera, but the microphone caught enough. "Everything will be ready before the board meeting," the man said. My father nodded. "Good." He tapped one of the papers. "She'll sign it. She trusts family." My chest tightened. My mother didn't argue. She simply looked toward the window before quietly asking, "What if Vivian notices?" My father actually smiled. "She won't." The confidence in his voice hurt more than anything else. He wasn't hoping I wouldn't notice. He was certain I never would. I replayed those words again in my head. She trusts family. Suddenly dozens of little memories I had dismissed over the years began floating back to the surface. My father insisting on keeping copies of important company records, just in case. My mother volunteering to organize legal paperwork because she claimed I worked too much. The times they had offered to stop by the house while I traveled for client meetings. None of those moments had seemed suspicious. Together, they suddenly felt very different. "How long?" I asked quietly. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally Noelle answered. "Longer than you want to know." I closed my eyes. "You knew?" "Not everything." Her voice cracked. "I only started putting the pieces together a few months ago." I wanted to be angry with her. Instead, I heard the guilt in her voice and knew she had probably been carrying this alone for weeks. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't have proof." Before I could answer, another movement on the camera caught my attention. My father reached into his jacket pocket and removed a cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in bold black letters, were 4 words that instantly made my stomach drop. "Original trust documents." He stared at it for a moment before sliding it into the stranger's portfolio. Then he replaced it with another envelope that looked almost identical. The only difference was one tiny crease near the corner. If I hadn't watched him switch them with my own eyes, I never would have noticed. My breathing became shallow. Whatever those papers were, they mattered enough for my father to stage an elaborate deception in my own house. "Vivian," Noelle asked. "Are you still there?" I swallowed hard. "Yes! You believe me now?" I kept staring at the live feed. My father locked the safe, smoothed his tie, and adjusted the framed photo of our family that sat on my bookshelf. Then my parents smiled at each other, exactly the way they always did before leaving my house after Sunday dinner. They looked like 2 loving parents who had stopped by to check on their daughter. Except I had just watched them steal something from me. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The people I trusted most had been lying to me for far longer than today. As my father reached for the office light switch, I zoomed in on the desk one last time. A single sheet of paper had been left behind by mistake. I couldn't read the entire page through the grainy image, but one line near the top was still visible. It contained my name, followed by words that made every instinct inside me scream that my life was about to change forever. I didn't go home that afternoon. Every instinct told me to drive straight there, throw open the front door, and demand an explanation. But another voice, quieter and far more rational, reminded me that once people knew they had been discovered, they became unpredictable. I had spent 15 years negotiating contracts worth millions of dollars. I knew the value of information, and right now my parents had no idea I had watched every second of what happened inside my office. That ignorance was the only advantage I had. Instead of turning toward my neighborhood, I drove to a small coffee shop on the edge of downtown where Noelle was already waiting. She was sitting in the farthest corner, her untouched coffee growing cold. The moment I walked in, she stood up and wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't a dramatic embrace. It was the kind people give when they know words won't be enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I should have figured it out sooner. I stepped back and looked at her. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her usually neat hair was pulled into a careless knot. Whatever she had been carrying, it had clearly been eating away at her. Start from the beginning, I said quietly. No guessing. Just tell me everything you know, she nodded. About 4 months ago, Dad asked if I could help him organize some old family files. I thought he wanted to donate things to the Historical Society or something. While I was looking through the boxes, I found copies of company documents I'd never seen before. What kind of documents? Ownership records, trust paperwork, corporate resolutions. My heart sank. Did you ask him about them? She gave a bitter laugh. I did. He smiled and said you were too busy to deal with paperwork. So he was helping you? That sounded exactly like my father. He had always wrapped control inside concern. Growing up, he never ordered me to do something. He simply convinced me it was easier if he handled it himself. When I bought my first house, he insisted on reviewing every contract. When I expanded my business, he offered to keep duplicate records in his home office for safekeeping. Even after I became successful enough to hire accountants and attorneys, I still accepted his help because somewhere inside me, I was still trying to be the daughter who made him proud. That's not all, Noelle continued. Few weeks later, I stopped by your house to drop off Grandma's recipe book. Dad's truck was parked outside. I thought maybe he was fixing something. Was he? She slowly shook her head. He came out carrying one of your file boxes. I frowned. Why didn't you tell me? Because he told me you asked him to organize company records before the next board meeting. She looked down at her hands. I believed him. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since her phone call. How did you know to call me today? She reached into her purse and placed a small flash drive on the table. Because this morning I stopped by the banquet hall before meeting a client. I saw Mom and Dad sitting in the parking lot. They never went inside? You watched them? I thought it was strange. She took a deep breath. Then I saw that lawyer get into Dad's car. I remembered the man from the security footage. Do you know who he is? No. But I followed them. I stared at her. You followed our parents. Only for a few minutes. She gave me an embarrassed smile. They drove straight to your neighborhood. So you called me? I hoped I was wrong. She looked away. Wasn't. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup without taking a sip. Everything I believed about my family suddenly felt fragile. We had always been close. Sunday dinners, birthdays, Thanksgiving at my parents' house. My father carving the turkey while Mom complained he always made too much stuffing. None of those memories disappeared, but now they seemed to belong to someone else's life. There's something else, Noelle said. I almost didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it mattered. Tell me. Dad has been asking questions about your next board meeting. I frowned. What kind of questions? Whether you'll be attending in person. Whether all the directors are coming. Whether legal counsel will be there. A knot tightened in my stomach. And never asks about board meetings. Exactly. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with one word. Dad, Noelle looked at me. Are you going to answer? I hesitated before pressing accept. Hi, Dad. His voice sounded warm, exactly as it always had. Just checking on my favorite daughter. He always called me that, even though I had a sister sitting right across from me. It suddenly felt less like affection and more like habit. Everything okay? He asked. Fine, just running errands. Good, he chuckled softly. Your mother was worried because you left the banquet so quickly. I exchanged a glance with Noelle. Banquet, they had never even gone inside. I'm sorry, I said evenly. Work called. Always working, he laughed again. Don't forget dinner Sunday. I won't. Love you. There was no hesitation in his voice, not even after what I'd seen on the cameras. Love you too? I answered automatically before ending the call. I stared at the dark screen for several seconds. He's unbelievable, Noelle whispered. I nodded slowly. He's acting like nothing happened. Because he thinks you don't know. That sentence settled heavily between us. If Dad believed I knew nothing, then he would continue exactly as planned. That meant more opportunities to understand what he was really trying to accomplish. An hour later, we sat across from Adrian Holt in his office, overlooking a busy intersection. He wasn't flashy. No expensive artwork covered his walls. No dramatic speeches filled the room. He simply watched the security footage twice without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair. "Do you trust your parents?" The question caught me off guard. I did. That's not what I asked. I looked at the paused image of my father standing beside my safe. "I don't know anymore." Adrian nodded once. Good. Good. Because uncertainty keeps people careful." He folded his hands. "If you had walked into this office insisting your parents could never betray you, I couldn't help you." He asked dozens of questions. Who had access to my home? Who managed company records? Where were original corporate documents stored? Who approved changes to ownership agreements? Each answer made his expression more serious. Finally, he slid one document toward me. "I'd like permission to review every filing connected to your company over the last 3 years. You think this started that long ago? I think people rarely risk everything in a single afternoon." He pointed toward the security footage. "What you watched today wasn't improvisation." I swallowed hard. It was preparation. Exactly. Before leaving, Adrian gave me one instruction that sounded almost impossible. I stared at him. "What?" Smile. "Have dinner with your parents on Sunday. Answer their phone calls. Let them believe nothing has changed. And if they ask about today, they won't." He stood and walked to the window. People who believe they're in control rarely ask questions they don't have to ask. That evening, I unlocked my front door and walked into my house as if nothing had happened. Everything looked exactly the same. The framed photos, the polished hardwood floors, the scent of lavender from the candle I'd forgotten to blow out that morning. Yet the house no longer felt like mine. I went straight to the office. The safe was locked exactly as I had left it, inside. Every folder appeared to be in its proper place. If I hadn't watched the camera footage, I never would have questioned a thing. I carefully removed the cream-colored envelope marked "Trust Documents." It looked identical to the one my father had taken. The paper felt new, too new. I opened it and immediately noticed something strange. The signature at the bottom carried my name, Vivian Ashford, but I had never signed that page in my life. My own name was staring back at me, written by someone else's hand. For a long time, I simply stared at the signature. At first glance it looked convincing. The looping V in Vivian, the sharp angle in the A of Ashford. Even the little flourish I had developed after years of signing contracts looked almost identical to mine. If someone had handed me the document during a busy meeting, I probably would have accepted it without another thought. That realization frightened me more than the forgery itself. Whoever had signed my name hadn't guessed. They had studied me. I immediately photographed every page before placing everything back exactly where I found it. Adrian had warned me not to let anyone suspect I knew the truth, and I wasn't about to ignore the first piece of good advice I'd received since my world began falling apart. The next morning I arrived at the office before sunrise. Normally the early hours were my favorite part of the day. The design studio was silent. Fresh coffee filled the conference room. Sunlight slowly spilled across rows of material samples and architectural drawings. That quiet routine usually reminded me why I loved building this company. Instead, I found myself looking at every filing cabinet, every locked office, every framed photograph, wondering how many of those things were still truly under my control. My executive assistant, Melissa, walked in carrying my schedule. "Morning, Vivian, you look tired." I forced a smile. "Long week already," she laughed. "It's only Tuesday. Feels like Friday." She placed several folders on my desk. "Your father called earlier." My stomach tightened. "About what?" "He wanted to confirm next month's board meeting." I looked up. "He asked you?" "Yes." She frowned slightly. "He said he was helping you prepare some family documents." I nodded slowly, pretending it made perfect sense. "Thanks." After she left, I wrote down every detail in a notebook Adrian had given me. Time, date, exact wording. He had insisted I keep a timeline because memory fades while facts don't. Around lunchtime Adrian called. "Can you come by?" "Did you find something?" "Wise." His voice remained calm, but I had already learned calm usually meant serious. 40 minutes later, I sat across from him as he spread several certified public records across his desk. I reviewed every corporate filing connected to Ashford Design over the last 3 years. He slid one document toward me. Do you recognize this? It was a board resolution approving changes to shareholder voting rights. My eyes immediately found my own signature near the bottom. I've never seen this. Adrian nodded. I thought so. How could it even be filed? Because someone presented it as genuine. He placed another document beside the first. Then another. Then another. Every page contained my name. Every page carried a signature I had never written. There are 7 of them, he said quietly. 7. That we know about. I leaned back in my chair, trying to keep my breathing steady. What do they do? Adrian tapped the first page. This one gradually shifts voting authority during periods of executive absence. The second. This one allows temporary operational oversight. The third. This authorizes emergency restructuring under special circumstances. I looked at him. Emergency. He met my eyes. You're scheduled to spend 3 weeks overseas next month attending the International Design Summit in Milan. My heart skipped. How do they know I'll be gone? It's public information. Your keynote speech was announced months ago. Suddenly everything connected. My parents hadn't chosen random documents. They had built an entire legal pathway designed to activate while I was out of the country. They weren't trying to steal everything in one day, I whispered. Adrian slowly nodded. No, he pointed at the stack. They were creating the appearance that you approved each step yourself. I rubbed my forehead. My father had always encouraged me to travel. He insisted international exposure would help the company grow. Every time I worried about leaving operations behind, he reassured me. Family will always watch over what's yours. I finally understood what he had meant. Adrian opened another folder. There's more. He handed me copies of property transfer records. Recognize this address. I immediately did. It was the lakeside retreat my grandmother bought decades before I was born. She spent every summer there teaching Noelle and me how to identify birds by their songs and wildflowers by their leaves. After she passed away, I paid to renovate the cabin while carefully preserving everything she loved about it. That's Grandma's house. Adrian nodded. It was. My chest tightened. What do you mean? 3 months ago ownership was transferred into a private family holding company. I blinked. That's impossible. Unfortunately, it isn't. He turned the final page toward me. According to county records, you signed the authorization. My eyes dropped to the signature. Mine again, except it wasn't. I closed the folder before anger could overwhelm me. How much else? Adrian hesitated just long enough to answer without speaking. Enough that we need to assume every major asset has been touched. The drive home felt strangely quiet. I kept remembering summers at the lake. My grandmother sitting on the porch with lemonade. My father laughing as he repaired the old dock. My mother taking photographs of Noelle and me catching frogs in the shallow water. Those memories remained real. That made everything hurt more. Somewhere along the way, those same people had decided I was no longer their daughter. I had become an obstacle. Sunday dinner arrived exactly as it had every week for years. My parents' dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. My father poured wine while my mother fussed over whether everyone had enough vegetables. Noel sat across from me, carefully avoiding eye contact. We both knew we were performing. Business still keeping you busy? Dad asked. Always, I smiled. That's good. He carved another slice of chicken. Your grandmother would be proud of what you've built. The words almost made me laugh. Proud enough to erase my name from everything she left behind. Instead, I simply thanked him. Halfway through dinner, my cousin Andrew arrived unexpectedly with his wife and 2 little boys. Andrew hugged my father before greeting me with obvious hesitation. Hey, Viv, something about his tone felt different, colder. Later, while everyone gathered in the living room, I overheard one of the boys ask his father why Aunt Vivian never visited Grandpa anymore. Andrew answered quietly, believing I couldn't hear, she's busy. His wife added even more quietly, not everyone remembers where they came from. My stomach twisted. Those weren't their own words. Someone had planted that idea long before today. My parents had been rewriting my story behind my back. I wasn't the successful daughter who rebuilt the family business. I was the selfish one who forgot her family after becoming successful. Suddenly, dozens of awkward conversations over the past few years made sense. The strange looks from relatives, invitations that quietly stopped coming, birthday parties I somehow heard about after they happened. None of it had been accidental. After dessert, my mother asked me to help her carry dishes into the kitchen. Once we were alone, she smiled warmly. "You've been working too hard." "Maybe. Your father worries." I nearly asked whether he worried enough to forge my signature. Instead, I rinsed another plate. She gently touched my arm. "You know everything we do is for this family." I looked into her eyes, searching for some sign of guilt. I found only complete sincerity. That frightened me most of all. She truly believed what she was saying. On my drive home, Noelle called. "You heard Andrew?" "Yes. It's been happening for years." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "How long?" "Long enough that some people honestly believe you abandoned Mom and Dad after the company became successful." I stared through the windshield in silence. Before hanging up, Noelle whispered one sentence that made every hair on my arm stand up. "Viv, Dad isn't protecting the family business." She paused. "He's protecting something much bigger, and I finally know where to find it." I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Noelle's last words repeating inside my head. "Dad isn't protecting the family business. He's protecting something much bigger." I had spent days believing this was about forged signatures and stolen ownership. If my sister was right, those were only pieces of a much larger puzzle. By 7 the next morning, I was parked outside Adrian Holt's office before he even arrived. He looked mildly surprised when he stepped out of the elevator carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "Either you're very early," he said, "or you never went home. Neither of those sounds healthy." "They're not." He handed me one of the coffees. "Come in." 20 minutes later, Noelle joined us carrying an old cardboard archive box that looked as though it had spent years inside an attic. The corners were worn, and faded masking tape still clung to one side with handwriting that had almost disappeared. Adrian looked at the box before looking at Noelle. "What's inside?" She swallowed. "Hope everything." We cleared the conference table. Noelle carefully lifted the lid and removed several yellowed folders, old photographs, handwritten letters, and a thick leather journal with cracked edges. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "From Eleanor Whitmore." I frowned. "Grandma Eleanor?" "She isn't our grandmother," Noelle corrected gently. "She was Grandma Rose's closest friend." The name hit me like a forgotten melody. Eleanor Whitmore had practically lived next door to my grandmother for decades. After Grandma Rose passed away, Eleanor slowly disappeared from family gatherings. Dad always said she was getting older and preferred to keep to herself. I had believed him. Noelle slid the leather journal toward me. "She asked me to give this to you only if something happened." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The first page carried my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. "If you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong." My heartbeat quickened. Adrian leaned forward without interrupting. I slowly turned the page. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. Grandma had documented meetings, conversations, financial decisions, and even disagreements inside the family over nearly 12 years. Every page was dated. Every note was detailed. She wrote the way an engineer builds a bridge. Carefully, logically, leaving nothing to chance. Then one entry stopped me cold. "Gerald still believes the company belongs to him because he started it. He doesn't understand that building something and growing something are not the same thing. Vivian earned what she created. One day he may try to convince others otherwise." I stared at the words until they blurred. My grandmother had predicted this, years before she died. "There's more," Noelle whispered. She handed me a sealed envelope with my grandmother's initials pressed into red wax. The seal had never been broken. Adrian looked at it carefully. "Open it." Inside rested 3 documents. The first was a notarized letter. The second was an amendment to the family trust. The third was a handwritten statement, signed by 2 witnesses I recognized from childhood. Adrian read each page in complete silence. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Well?" I asked. He looked directly at me. "Your grandmother anticipated a challenge to the trust." I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. Meaning she created a separate amendment that becomes controlling if anyone attempts to alter ownership through deception or coercion. Noelle looked at me with tears already forming. "She protected you." Adrian continued reading. "According to this amendment, operational control of Ashford Design permanently belongs to the family member who independently expanded and sustained the business after its original incorporation." I frowned. "That's you," Adrian finished. "Specifically you." I sat back in stunned silence. For years my father had repeated the same story to everyone. He had built the company. Everything existed because of him. He deserved the final word. Grandma had apparently seen the danger in that thinking long before any of us did. "Why didn't she tell us?" I asked quietly. Noelle answered before Adrian could. "Because she thought Dad would eventually accept it." I closed my eyes. He never did. Adrian gathered the papers carefully. "No," he tapped the amendment. "Instead, it appears he spent years trying to make sure this document disappeared." A memory surfaced, so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. 3 weeks after Grandma's funeral, Dad had insisted on organizing all her legal files. He claimed everyone was too emotional to deal with paperwork. I remembered helping carry boxes into his truck. I remembered Mom thanking me for trusting Dad to handle everything. I remembered thinking how lucky we were to have someone willing to shoulder that responsibility. Now I wondered how many truths disappeared into those boxes. "Elena said Grandma visited her the week before she died," Noelle said softly. "She gave her copies." "Copies?" "She told Elena she hoped she'd never need them." Adrian smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "Your grandmother was smarter than anyone gave her credit for." I laughed quietly through the tension. She always was. We spent the next several hours comparing the trust amendment with the documents currently filed under the company's records. The differences were subtle but devastating. Entire paragraphs had been rewritten, protective clauses had vanished, dates had shifted. Most alarming of all, every alteration benefited exactly one person, Gerald Ashford. "These weren't random edits," Adrian said. "Someone systematically removed every safeguard your grandmother created. Can we prove it?" I asked. He looked toward the original amendment, lying safely inside a protective folder. "Yes." For the first time since Noelle's phone call, I felt something besides fear. Hope. It wasn't overwhelming. It was cautious, fragile, but it existed. Then Adrian's assistant knocked gently on the conference room door. "Sorry to interrupt." She handed him a printed email. He read it once before passing it to me. The subject line read Ashford Family Governance Meeting. My father had scheduled a mandatory family and shareholder meeting for the following Friday afternoon. Attendance required. Final ownership restructuring documents to be executed. I looked up slowly. "He's moving faster," Adrian nodded. "Because he thinks everything is already in place." "Can we stop it?" He smiled slightly. "We could, but I'd rather let him finish." Noelle frowned. "Why?" Adrian folded the email and placed it beside the original trust amendment. "Because people reveal the most when they believe they've already won." That afternoon, I drove to Eleanor Whitmore's small farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She greeted me before I reached the porch, as if she'd been expecting me all day. She was 72 now, slower than I remembered, but with the same clear blue eyes that had once watched Noelle and me race bicycles down Grandma's gravel driveway. Before I could say anything, she embraced me. "Your grandmother loved you fiercely," she whispered. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" She gently took my hand and led me onto the porch. "Because Rose wanted you to build your future without constantly looking over your shoulder." We sat together for nearly 2 hours. She told me stories I'd never heard, how Grandma defended every decision I made after college when Dad insisted I was wasting money expanding the company, How she secretly loaned money against her own savings so I could hire my first design team after the bank rejected my application. How she repeatedly warned Dad that love and ownership were not the same thing. She knew this might happen, I said quietly. Elena nodded sadly. She prayed it wouldn't. Before I left, she reached into a wooden cabinet and handed me one final envelope. What's this? Insurance. Inside were 3 old photographs. In each one, my grandmother stood beside the original company charter while signing the trust amendment in front of witnesses. The dates matched perfectly. Every image destroyed another lie my father had carefully constructed. As I climbed back into my car, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Dad. Looking forward to seeing everyone Friday. It's finally time to secure the family's future. I looked down at the photographs resting on the passenger seat and typed only 3 words in reply. I'll be there. He thought Friday would end with me signing away everything my grandmother intended me to protect. What he didn't know was that, for the first time in years, the truth was finally sitting on my side of the table. Friday arrived with the strange calm that sometimes comes before a violent storm. I woke before sunrise, made coffee I never drank, and stood in my kitchen staring through the window at the small herb garden my grandmother had helped me plant years earlier. She used to tell me that patience wasn't about waiting. It was about trusting that the truth would eventually grow if you gave it enough time. Until a week ago, I thought she had been talking about tomatoes. Now I understood she had been talking about people. My phone buzzed at exactly 7:30. It was Adrian. Everything ready? He asked. As ready as I'll ever be. Good. Remember, today isn't about winning an argument. Then what's it about? Letting your father tell his version of the story before we introduce the facts. I smiled despite myself. You really enjoy this part, don't you? I've learned something over 30 years, he replied. People who spend years building a lie usually can't resist making it bigger when they think no one will challenge them. We agreed to meet separately. He didn't want anyone connecting us before the meeting. My role was simple. Show up, smile, listen, ask almost nothing. Around noon, Noelle stopped by my office carrying a slim folder. She closed the door behind her before speaking. Cloud backup is complete. Everything. Every camera recording from the last 18 months. She placed the folder on my desk. Dad deleted the files from your local storage after he swapped the documents. I frowned. He deleted them. She nodded. He just didn't know your security company automatically stores encrypted copies online. I let out a slow breath. Dad had always believed he understood technology well enough to stay ahead of everyone else. That confidence had become another weakness. Melissa doesn't know any of this, does she? I asked. No. Good. The fewer people involved, the safer everyone would be. Before leaving, Noelle hesitated at the doorway. Viv. Yeah. Whatever happens today, she swallowed. I'm proud of you. I felt something tighten in my throat. For years I had chased those words from the wrong people. Hearing them from my little sister somehow meant more than I expected. Thank you, I said softly. For believing me before I believed myself, she smiled sadly. Never stopped believing you. I just needed proof that everyone else was wrong. The family governance meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock inside the original Ashford Design showroom. We still used the restored building for annual shareholder gatherings because my father insisted it honored the company's history. Looking around the familiar space, I suddenly realized how symbolic today really was. The old brick walls represented where we came from. The modern furniture surrounding them represented everything I had built afterward. Almost every member of the extended family was already there. My cousin Andrew stood near the coffee table speaking quietly with 2 minority investors. My Aunt Carol arranged pastries while pretending not to stare every time I walked past. The atmosphere felt unusually formal, as if everyone sensed something important was about to happen. Dad approached wearing his favorite navy suit. He smiled warmly before embracing me. There she is. His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Calm, confident, proud. Ready for today. I returned the hug without hesitation. Of course. Good. He rested a hand on my shoulder. After this meeting, you'll have so much less to worry about. I looked directly into his eyes. I'm counting on that. He smiled, apparently pleased with my answer. Across the room, Mom gave me a reassuring nod. If she felt guilty, she hid it remarkably well. By 2:15 everyone had taken their seats. Dad stood at the front beside a projector screen displaying the Ashford Design logo. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "This company has always been more than a business. It's a family legacy." Several relatives nodded. He continued speaking about tradition, sacrifice, and responsibility. Listening to him felt surreal. Every sentence sounded sincere because he genuinely believed his own version of history, according to Dad. Every major decision that built the company had been made collectively. Every success belonged equally to the family. Every difficult season had been overcome through unity. The truth contained pieces of all those statements. The problem was what he intentionally left out. He never mentioned the nights I slept in my office while negotiating contracts that kept us from bankruptcy. He never mentioned the personal loans I signed when banks refused to finance our expansion. He never mentioned the years Noelle watched me miss birthdays and holidays because I was trying to save the business. Everyone now celebrated. Instead, he presented the company as though it had naturally grown under his wise guidance. Finally, he reached the subject everyone had been waiting for. "As many of you know," he said, "Vivian's schedule continues to become more demanding every year." He smiled toward me. "We're all incredibly proud of her success." Around the room came polite applause. "However," he continued, "good leadership also means planning for stability." He clicked the remote. A slide appeared outlining a proposed governance restructuring. These updates simply formalize responsibilities that already exist, nothing more. He made it sound harmless, practical, temporary. If I hadn't seen the forged documents days earlier, I might have believed him myself. My cousin Andrew raised a hand. "Does this change ownership?" Dad smiled reassuringly. "Not at all. It was technically true. Ownership and control are not always the same thing." He was carefully choosing words that sounded honest while hiding their real meaning. "Vivian has already reviewed everything," he added casually. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I smiled politely. "I've seen the documents." Another technically true statement. Dad looked satisfied. "Excellent." Mom distributed leather folders around the table. I recognized the cream-colored envelope immediately. It matched the one I had watched Dad replace inside my safe. He opened his own copy and began explaining each section with practiced confidence. Temporary authority during executive travel, emergency operational oversight, long-term continuity planning. Every clause sounded reasonable when described individually. Together, they quietly transferred nearly every meaningful decision into Dad's hands. "Any questions?" he asked. Silence filled the room. Then he looked at me. "Vivian." I slowly opened my folder. The forged signature waited on the final page exactly where Adrian predicted it would be. Dad slid an expensive fountain pen across the table. "All that's left." He smiled warmly enough to fool anyone who didn't know him. "Is your signature?" I picked up the pen. Around the room, several relatives relaxed, believing the meeting was almost over. Dad folded his hands, completely certain he had already won. I uncapped the pen, looked down at the signature line, then gently set it back on the table. "Before I sign," I said quietly, "I'd like everyone to meet someone." Dad's smile faded for the first time all afternoon. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. Adrian Holt stepped inside carrying 2 locked document cases, and behind him walked Eleanor Whitmore holding a weathered leather journal no one in the Ashford family had seen in over a decade. The room fell completely silent. My father didn't move. He simply stared at Adrian, then at Eleanor, as though his mind couldn't quite accept what his eyes were seeing. I had watched Gerald Ashford solve impossible problems my entire life. Suppliers backed out at the last minute. Equipment failed. Banks rejected loan applications. Somehow he always found another solution. For the first time in my life, I saw him without one. Adrian closed the conference room door behind him before placing 2 locked document cases on the long walnut table. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I apologize for interrupting." Dad recovered just enough to force a smile. "This is a private family meeting." Adrian nodded. "Not anymore." He slid a business card across the table. "I'm legal counsel for Vivian Ashford." Around the room, chairs shifted as people exchanged confused glances. My cousin Andrew looked from my father to me, obviously trying to understand what was happening. Mom's face slowly lost its color. She looked at me, then at Adrian, then back at the folder in front of her. "Vivian," she began softly. I didn't answer. Adrian opened the first document case with a small key and removed several thick binders labeled with colored tabs. "Before any documents are signed today," he said calmly, "I'd like everyone present to review information directly related to the proposed restructuring." Dad straightened his shoulders. "There isn't any need for that." Adrian smiled politely. "Actually, there is." He handed copies of several reports to every shareholder around the table. "These are certified forensic document examinations completed 48 hours ago." I watched Andrew flip through the first few pages before looking up in confusion. "Forensic?" Adrian nodded. "Specifically regarding signatures appearing on governance documents filed over the past 3 years." Dad's attorney, whom I hadn't even noticed sitting quietly near the corner, leaned forward and began reading. His expression changed almost immediately. Dad looked toward him. "Mark." The attorney didn't answer. He kept reading. Adrian continued. "Independent handwriting experts compared MEMS. Ashford's authenticated signatures with signatures appearing on 7 corporate filings." He paused long enough for everyone to absorb the statement. "Their conclusion is unanimous." He looked around the room. Those signatures were not written by Vivian Ashford. The silence that followed felt almost physical. My father let out a short laugh. "That's ridiculous." Adrian calmly pressed a button on a small remote. A large monitor mounted on the conference room wall lit up. "Perhaps." The first image appeared. It showed my office exactly as I remembered it. Dad's eyes immediately widened. "What is this?" Adrian didn't answer. The timestamp in the corner clearly displayed the afternoon Noelle had called me. Every person in the room watched as my father unlocked my wall safe. My mother quietly looked toward the door. The unidentified attorney entered carrying his portfolio. No one spoke. The only sounds came from the security recording itself. Then everyone heard my father's own voice. "She'll never question us." Andrew slowly lowered the papers in his hands. Aunt Carol covered her mouth. My father stood abruptly. "This proves nothing," Adrian nodded. "You're right." He clicked the remote again. "By itself, it doesn't." Another image appeared. This time it showed a timeline of encrypted cloud backups from my home security provider. Every visit to my office during the previous 18 months had been automatically preserved. Date after date appeared across the screen. Different afternoons. Different evenings. The same people entering my office while I was traveling for work. My father's confidence visibly weakened. Those recordings were deleted. Noelle finally spoke. "Orly from the house." Every eye turned toward my sister. She stood slowly. "You forgot cloud storage existed." Dad stared at her in disbelief. "You?" She nodded sadly. "I stopped trusting coincidences a long time ago." Adrian opened the second document case. "Next." "We'd like everyone to meet Eleanor Whitmore." Eleanor slowly walked to the front of the room, carrying my grandmother's weathered leather journal. Some of the older relatives immediately recognized her. She smiled gently before placing the journal beside the projector. "Rose asked me to protect these records if she ever became worried about the family's future." Dad interrupted sharply. "That journal is irrelevant." Eleanor looked directly at him. "You know it isn't." She opened the first page. Adrian projected scanned copies onto the screen behind her. Every entry was dated years before my grandmother passed away. Every note documented discussions about the company's future. Then came the page that changed everything. Eleanor read aloud in a steady voice. "Gerald still believes ownership belongs to whoever began the company. He refuses to accept that Vivian built something entirely different. If he ever attempts to alter the trust, these records must be preserved. No one in the room moved. Dad slowly sat back down. Adrian carefully removed one final folder from the document case. There's something else. He held up the original trust amendment, signed by my grandmother. This document has remained in secure private custody since the day it was executed. My father's attorney stood and walked closer before asking quietly, "May I examine that?" Adrian handed it over without hesitation. For nearly 3 minutes the room remained silent, while the attorney compared signatures, witness seals, and notarizations. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "It's authentic." Dad looked at him. "Mark?" The attorney shook his head. "Gerald, it's authentic. I watched years of certainty disappear from my father's face." But Adrian wasn't finished. Final matter. He displayed another slide showing financial transfers linked to the family holding company. Charts connected dates, forged resolutions, property transfers, and voting changes. Every line led back to the same destination, Gerald Ashford. These transactions relied upon governance authority obtained through documents carrying forged signatures. Adrian explained. If those signatures are invalid, every subsequent transfer becomes legally questionable. Andrew looked at my father with genuine disbelief. "Dad, you told all of us Vivian approved this." My father finally found his voice. "She would have." I felt something inside me quietly break, not because of the forged papers, not because of the stolen authority, because even now, standing in front of undeniable evidence, he still believed my choices belonged to him. I slowly stood. "You never asked." He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "Everything I did was for this family." "No." My voice remained calm. "Everything you did was so you could decide what this family looked like." Mom suddenly began crying, not dramatic sobs. Quiet tears she seemed unable to stop. She looked toward me with trembling hands. "Vivian? Did you know?" I asked gently. She closed her eyes. Not all of it. "Did you know the signatures weren't mine?" Her silence answered before she ever spoke. Around the table, relatives who had supported my parents for years slowly lowered their eyes. No one defended them anymore. No one questioned the evidence. Dad looked around the room searching for someone, anyone, to stand beside him. There was no one left. He reached for the folder in front of him, as though hoping to find another explanation hidden somewhere inside the pages. Instead, his hands simply stopped moving. The man who always had the final word opened his mouth and couldn't find a single sentence worth saying. Mom looked at him with tears running down her face and whispered the only question that mattered. "Gerald, what have we done?" For a few long seconds, no one in the room moved. The projector still displayed the final page of my grandmother's trust amendment, but nobody was reading it anymore. Every face had turned toward my father. All those years he had been the loudest voice in every family discussion, the man everyone automatically looked to before making a decision. Now the silence around him felt heavier than any accusation. He slowly lowered himself into his chair and stared at the table without saying a word. I had imagined this moment so many times over the past week. I thought I would feel victorious. I thought watching his carefully constructed world collapse would satisfy something inside me. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Adrian quietly gathered the remaining evidence into neat stacks while the company's independent board chairman, Thomas Mercer, cleared his throat. "As chairman," he said carefully, "I believe we have only one responsible course of action." Everyone looked toward him. "Until the legal review is complete, every governance change approved under these disputed documents will be suspended immediately." He turned toward me. "Mims Ashford, operational authority remains exactly where it has always belonged." I nodded once. "Thank you." Dad finally lifted his head. "Thomas." His voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. "You're making a mistake." Thomas sighed. "Gerald, I wish that were true." He glanced at the forensic reports. "But these documents leave me very little room for doubt." My father's attorney quietly closed his briefcase. "I think my client and I should speak privately." Dad didn't move. "There's nothing left to discuss." The attorney hesitated before answering honestly. "There is, But not here. He walked out of the conference room alone. That was the moment my father truly understood he had lost. One by one, relatives who had avoided looking at me all afternoon slowly approached. Andrew was the first. He stopped a few feet away with his hands buried in his pockets. Vivi, he struggled to find the right words. I'm sorry. I offered him a tired smile. For what? He looked ashamed. I believed things I should have questioned. I remembered the conversation I'd overheard after Sunday dinner, the way he'd quietly repeated the story Dad had fed the family for years. You weren't the only one, I said gently. He nodded. Still, I should have called you instead of assuming. I squeezed his shoulder. Just don't make that mistake again. Aunt Carol stepped forward next. Tears filled her eyes before she even spoke. Your mother always told us you were too busy for family. I looked toward Mom, who remained seated with both hands covering her face. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Carol whispered. I should have asked you, one after another. Similar conversations unfolded around the room. None of them erased the hurt of the past several years. But hearing people admit they had been wrong somehow made carrying that hurt a little easier. Eventually only 4 people remained inside the conference room. Me? No, Mom. Dad. The silence stretched until Mom finally stood and walked toward us. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. Vivian, she whispered. I met her eyes without speaking. I don't know how to ask you to forgive me, I answered honestly. Then don't. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never wanted to hurt you. Maybe not. My voice stayed calm. But every time you stayed silent, you helped someone else do it. She closed her eyes. You're right. Dad remained seated across the room. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't denied anything else. He simply stared through the window toward the parking lot where dozens of cars were beginning to leave. Finally he spoke without looking at me. I built this family. I shook my head slowly. No, he looked up. You started it. I took a slow breath. There's a difference. He frowned. You think papers change that? No. I looked around the showroom filled with employees, relatives, and photographs documenting decades of work. People do. Another long silence followed. For the first time in my life, my father had no lecture prepared. No explanation. No speech about responsibility. Just silence. I turned toward Noelle. Ready? She smiled through tears. More than ever. We walked out together without looking back. The legal process lasted another 3 months. Adrian's team worked with investigators, accountants, and corporate regulators to unwind every unauthorized transaction connected to the forged documents. The family holding company my father had used to absorb control over company assets was dissolved. The lakeside property my grandmother loved was legally restored to the family trust under its original terms. Every governance amendment carrying forged signatures was declared invalid. Most importantly, the original trust amendment my grandmother had protected through Eleanor became the controlling legal document exactly as she intended. Several weeks later, the board unanimously confirmed me as permanent chairwoman and chief executive without any disputed conditions attached. They also voted to create an independent oversight committee so no single family member, including me, could ever quietly manipulate company governance again. I insisted on that change myself. Trust should never depend entirely on one person. It should depend on transparency. Noelle accepted a position on the board, though only after arguing with me for almost an hour. People will think you gave me the seat because I'm your sister. I laughed. People will think that for about 5 minutes. And after that they'll notice you're the reason we still have a company. She rolled her eyes. You're impossible. Runs in the family. We both laughed before falling unexpectedly quiet. Maybe not anymore, she said. A month later, I drove to the lakeside house for the first time since everything happened. The porch looked exactly as I remembered. The old oak tree still leaned slightly toward the water. The wind still carried the same smell of pine and fresh rain. I unlocked the front door and found a small wooden box sitting on the kitchen table. Adrian had arranged for several personal items recovered during the investigation to be returned there. Inside the box rested my grandmother's favorite fountain pen, the tiny brass key to her sewing cabinet, and a folded letter addressed simply to my girls. Noelle arrived a few minutes later. We opened it together. Grandma's handwriting filled the page. She wrote about family, forgiveness, and the responsibility that comes with being trusted by others. The final paragraph made both of us cry. If one day the two of you must choose between protecting my possessions and protecting each other, choose each other. Houses can be rebuilt, companies can be rebuilt, real family cannot. Noelle wiped her eyes before laughing softly. She knew us too well. I nodded. She always did. A few days after reading that letter, I signed new ownership documents, not to transfer control away from myself, but to ensure the company's future could never again depend on hidden papers or secret meetings. Then I drove to the county clerk's office with one final envelope. Inside was the deed to my grandmother's lakeside house. I handed it to Noelle without saying a word. She looked confused until she opened it. "Viv?" Her voice broke. "What is this?" Grandma wanted someone she could trust to protect that place. Tears filled her eyes again. "You should keep it." I smiled and gently closed her fingers around the envelope. The company came from me. I looked toward the lake where our grandmother once taught us how to skip stones. "But this house survived because of you." She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I didn't save the house," she whispered. I smiled through my own tears. "No, I held my little sister for a long moment." "You saved your sister." 6 months have passed since that meeting. My father retired quietly after settling every legal claim. My mother still sends birthday cards every year. I read every one of them, but I haven't been ready to answer. Maybe one day I will. Maybe I won't. Healing isn't something you schedule on a calendar. It's something you choose when your heart is finally ready. As for me, I no longer measure success by awards, profits, or titles. I measure it by the people who stood beside me when believing me was difficult. Looking back now, I realize the security camera didn't expose the biggest secret in my life. It simply gave me the chance to see who was willing to protect me when the truth became inconvenient. Sometimes karma isn't watching the people who hurt you lose everything. Sometimes it's discovering the people who quietly refuse to lose you. If you've ever learned that your real family wasn't the one you expected, I'd truly love to hear your story in the comments. Thank you for spending this journey with me, and wherever life takes you, never underestimate the quiet courage of someone who chooses the truth over comfort. A year has passed since the day my sister told me not to go home, and sometimes I still catch myself opening the security camera app before leaving the office at night. Not because I'm afraid anymore, but because that moment changed the way I understand trust forever. Ashford Design is stronger than it has ever been. We didn't become stronger because we won a legal battle. We became stronger because we stopped pretending that silence protects a family. It doesn't, honesty does. Noelle and I still disagree about paint colors, furniture collections, and expansion plans almost every week, but every disagreement ends the same way. We talk, we listen. We choose each other before we choose being right. The lakeside house has become our favorite place again. Every summer we invite our employees and their families there for a simple weekend together, just as Grandma Rose once invited us. We restored the old dock, planted new flower beds, and even framed one of Grandma's handwritten recipes in the kitchen. It reminds me that the most valuable inheritance she left behind was never the company or the property. It was the belief that character always outlives wealth. My mother still writes to me. Her letters are no longer filled with excuses. They are filled with memories, apologies, and quiet hopes that one day we might share another cup of coffee without lawyers, documents, or old lies standing between us. I don't know what the future holds for us, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel pressured to decide before I'm ready. Forgiveness is a gift, but trust has to be earned all over again. As for my father, I honestly don't spend much time wondering how he's doing, not because I hate him, but because carrying resentment would only give his choices more power over my life. Letting go turned out to be the greatest victory I never expected. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that family isn't defined by who shares your last name. Family is the person who calls and says, "Don't go home," because protecting you matters more than protecting a secret. Looking back, I don't wish that terrible day had never happened. Without it, I might have spent the rest of my life believing a comforting lie instead of living in an honest truth. And if you've ever discovered that the person who stood beside you in your darkest moment wasn't the one you expected, I'd truly love to hear your story, because sometimes the family we keep is far more important than the family we inherit.